Welcome, folks. Today we have an exciting episode for you, and you know what? Just skip to the theme song. We're cutting the intro. We're going straight to it. We don't have time today, folks. Let's go.
Welcome back, folks, to the Apocalypsis Historia YouTube channel podcast, where we're ready to weave you through the whimsical worlds and walk the wonders of the past. And whether you're a fresh face finding us for the first time, or if you're a loyal listener leaning into the history's hidden halls today, your support on Patreon propels us to the pursuit of the past, and we are providing plenty of exclusive content on there, so don't forget to like, subscribe, and strike that notification bell to never miss out on our marvelous mysteries. And so, Chance, you've hyped us up today. You shot us. You know, you literally had to fourth wall break out of the intro and put it.
I am fired up today, folks.
Acknowledge the music.
As you see, we got some stuff lined up for you. We got some essays. We have some texts. Let's see today, folks. Lately, Brady and I have been moving more and more towards this whole Philip Sidney thing. We're gaining support, but it's not revolutionizing the world. We haven't done the legwork to do that, to be totally fair. But I think we've thrown out enough compelling stuff for people to say, "Wait, what the heck?"
And now for your example here, if some of our highest viewed stuff is got to be, some of our early stuff that we started posting last year, the document stuff.
Which I'm totally excited that Henslow Diary and Handy are like our two, biggest favorites, because I'm all about attribution, and this is like going to the ground level attribution. And then,
obviously a DeVere video that was kind of hot.
Super interesting.
People love commenting on all the document stuff because they like pitching their
they want to see the ground level, what's happening back in the day.
Glad to see this history of Shakespeare climbing up, actually.
Yeah.
But down here we've got some more general future Shakespeare studies. Kind of group theory wins.
Right.
Maybe over here with the authorship one. But then right down here you finally get to this. The true Shakespeare video, which was our first.
Which it's really the true Samuel Daniel video.
Yeah,
to be fair, we don't talk too much about Shakespeare, but it is totally about Samuel Daniel being not a well-documented figure, and then Philip Sidney, his life and everything in his life matches up perfectly in dovetail fashion with Samuel Daniel, and that. If you are into Shakespearean studies, you do know that Samuel Daniel's kind of a weird wild card going on with Shakespeare in the mid-90s. The works of Samuel Daniel that are coming out in 1594, his Civil War poems, are kind of all over Shakespeare's plays, especially Richard II, maybe the Henry IV plays, and it's like, what the heck's going on there? But then that's also maybe during or right at the end of Shakespeare's versification era, where he's doing a lot of poetry in his plays. Think of Love's Labour's Lost, think of Romeo and Juliet, think of Richard II, where we have tons and tons of verse instead of prose. Well, Samuel Daniel is the poet, right? And so it seems to me that there may be something weird going on there, and maybe that's where Sidney pops in Shakespeare.
Yeah, so that video is all about connecting Daniel to Shakespeare and all that scene. But then we've got some other stuff in here, and one all about Decker and Nash. But some of the stuff that we're really trying to be like, hey, folks, we're sounding the Philip Sidney signal here. The John D video, I don't know, we thought that would be, sort of...
and
that one's a big, long one to chew on. So,
there's a whole technical thing with that, by the way, folks. That video may have gotten more views and may have just lost views because YouTube has this sort of algorithm thing where they go through and comb through, make sure bots aren't watching it, and they'll take down view numbers, and that has happened with that video several times in an odd proportion as relative to our other videos. So if we look on an app that shows us the true view count, it is well over 500. So it does seem like people are super into John Dee, but people just don't seem to be latching on to the Philip Sidney thing.
Yeah, where it's like, some of these are older, and that totally makes sense about, where they are. But I thought, us going through the defensive poetry, those two, I was sort of proud on us, literally walking line by line and being like, hey, this is kind of interesting. If really
we treat
connects.
those two videos as one video, it's like 500 views. So, like, Philip Sidney videos are good for like 500 views. And Sidney and Greville, that's got a ways to go, but maybe we can count that along with the Megaliospora video as well. It's a sequel, which this isn't a complaint. I understand that people want to watch what they want to watch, but at some point, we need to do more to really relay to you what is happening here, because what Brady and I continually keep finding over and over and over and over is that there are links from Shakespeare to Philip Sidney. A lot of times indirectly, but a lot of times very directly, and it's hard to account for. And so today, we're gonna take a little look, not so much at Love's Labor's Lost, but this will come up a bunch, so I just have it here. But we're gonna take a look today at a book by a man named Alwyn Thaler, who was an actual Elizabethan literature scholar. This is by Harvard University Press. This is a reprint. The book comes out back in the 40s, 1947, I want to say. And this is called Shakespeare and Sir Philip Sidney, The Influence of the Defense of Poetry, or Poesy. So if we flip through it real quick, because this is a whole 100-page monograph. We don't have time to maybe go through all of this, but I want to just quickly go through some stuff, specifically in the preface and in the first section, or maybe the first two sections. But Alwyn Thaler started looking at the defense of poetry, and as he was reading it, because he's a Shakespearean scholar, as he was reading defense of poetry, this is later in his career too. This is after he's got years and years of experience. He's reading back through defense of poetry, and he's like, wait, what the heck? That's in Shakespeare. Wait, what the heck? That's in Shakespeare. What the heck? That's in Shakespeare. And since he's written this, I think some people have definitely acknowledged it, but it's not totally blown wide open. It's not like everybody's like, oh my god, Shakespeare's obsessed with Sidney, although that does seem to be the case. And you Oxfordians out there, you'll very much acknowledge that Shakespeare, aka Edward de Vere, is totally aware of the defense of poetry, and that he maybe even responds to it by changing the stuff in Famous Victories of Henry V into what we get with the Shakespeare version of Henry V. And he's doing it because of the defense of poetry. But as much as Oxfordians have definitely pointed that out, and kudos to them, there's a lot of stuff that I've not seen them point out that is totally worth pointing out that Alwyn Thaler points out. And so, all you guys that think that Oxford hates Sidney and that Oxford's Shakespeare, you're going to have to redefine one of those two terms, if not both, because of what I'm going to show you. Understand that. That there is so much of Sidney's defense of poetry in Shakespeare that if you want to pitch that De Vere is Shakespeare, you have to account for how obsessed he is with Sidney's essay Defense of Poetry. Okay. Hope I made that abundantly clear.
And there's also the inevitable, well, maybe Oxford actually just wrote defensive poesy, and so it's fair game that everyone can start poaching each other's candidates here.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Beethoven actually wrote Shakespeare. Or something,
I would rather that than the other. I would rather that because at least they're acknowledging that yes, there's so much influence that it's undeniable. It's so undeniable that they just have to poach it themselves. I would rather that than them just say, no, there's no influence. Because dude's got 100 pages here. And by the way, we got some other texts here that we may go into. We got Sidney the Maker's Mind by Dorothy Connell, by Oxford Press. Once again, this is by Harvard University Press by Alwyn Thaler, 2013 edition. We have several essays. There's two that I want to maybe go into today. We got Love's Labor's Lost. And the zoom in.
I won't be able to see it right now.
Okay, my bad. Okay, we got Love's Labor's Lost. And The Renaissance Vision of Love by Neil Goldstein, in which he continually recourses back to Sidney, specifically Astrophil and Estella, but other Sidney as well, and he compares it back to Love's Labor's Lost. And then we also have Shakespeare, Sidney, and Marlowe, The Metamorphoses of Love by none other than the great Cyrus Hoy. And that is like taking a look at, once again, this whole aspect of love poetry, and it's comparing Sidney and some of the ideas in the Arcadia specifically back to Shakespeare, specifically Shakespearean comedies, as well as just all the works of Marlowe. And we're going to see like a thematic through line through all of it. And once again, we probably won't read the whole essays because these are, 20-something page essays. This is a 100-page monograph, but we want to go through this and show you that you need to go check these essays out. You need to start thinking about the possibility that Philip Sidney, if he's not Shakespeare, he's so darn close to Shakespeare that some kind of other explanation needs to be had. And maybe we're opening the door for the, Mary Sidney as Shakespeare people, the Pembroke scholars. Maybe we're opening the door to De Vere is Shakespeare, but we need to redefine what his and Sidney's relationship is. Maybe we're opening the door back to stuff like Edward Dyer or Fulk Greville. If you cannot accept that Philip Sidney is Shakespeare, fine. But you have to open the door to something else, because as it stands, like the Stratford Man, like to me, Philip Sidney is maybe the best argument against the Stratford Man. How the heck does the Stratford Man ever get so influenced by Philip Sidney if he's nowhere near the literary scene when Philip Sidney is? Philip Sidney's supposed to be dead and gone by 86. Stratford Man shows up maybe 1590, 1589, or 88 at the earliest. People try to be generous with that. Why is he so influenced by Philip Sidney? Well, let's go in and see if, in fact, he is influenced, whoever Shakespeare is.
And as another testament to some of this like Sidney stuff, and let's all be honest here. How many of you have read all of Arcadia? How many of you have read all of the eclogue stuff?
Yeah.
Like Sidney has a large body of work, and it seems pretty heady trying to get into it. So it's not. I don't know. It's dense stuff, And
Absolutely.
So, I don't know. It's it's a lot of homework to do.
Similar to what we were saying back when in our first live stream. Everybody knows Shakespeare sonnets by like the back of their hands, but pull up a Spenser sonnet. Can you spot that for Spenser immediately? Pull up a Drayton sonnet or a Daniel sonnet. Some deep cut from Delia and some deep cut from Idea. Can you tell that they're Daniel versus Drayton or vice versa? Can you tell that they're not Shakespeare other than having all 154 Shakespeare already memorized? Well, you have to read those to do that. You have to go read those a lot. And I don't think as many people are reading outside of Shakespeare, and that's been a common theme throughout all of our videos, that you got to go read Ben Jonson, you got to go read Christopher Marlowe, you got to go read Henry Constable, you got to go read freaking Thomas Sackville, you got to go read
Fletcher and Beaumont.
I'm here to say for everyone out there that you don't have to read Fletcher and Beaumont. You can read Fletcher. Don't read Beaumont. Just skip Night of the Burning Pestle. What a stupid play. My bad. Okay, let's dive into this real quick. Let's go into Thaler's. We're gonna go into the preface, and that'll be like right past the opening pages. Yeah, there we go. Okay, folks, here we go. I just want to read a few of the opening quotes from the first paragraph. In the quick forge and working house of thought, which was the mind of Shakespeare, which I already like that he says working house of thought. And by the way, he's a total Stratfordian, guys. This is not some Shakespeare doubter. This is some guy that makes a living saying Shakespeare is Shakespeare, but already framing it as a working house, almost like a group of people working in a house. Okay.
Freudian slip? Much?
Yeah. It's subliminal, right?
Yeah. Archaic or Jungian slip?
Yeah. In the quick forge of and working house of thought, which was the mind of Shakespeare, many diverse elements were strangely, also strange, Fernando Standy, Lord Strange. Sorry, I won't keep doing this because that's not Thaler's intention, but many diverse elements were strangely and wonderfully fused. This essay calls attention to one of these elements which has not previously been recognized, though it is clearly important if true. The possibility that it might be true that Shakespeare's plays and poems demonstrably reflect the influence of Sidney's defensive poetry first occurred to me, Alwyn Thaler, almost 10 years ago, when I was studying Shakespeare's utterances on style, imagination, and poetry, which, if you've been listening to me and Brady, we've been saying it's the same imagination, it's the same style developing through time, and it's the same sensibility of poetry. I can't tell you how much I think Sonnet 76 reminds me of the opening sonnet of Astrophil and Stella. I think you're crazy if it doesn't. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it is the same author. Influence is a real thing, and I need to check myself before I wreck myself. So let us continue before I go too crazy. Let's see. Then and later, one question troubled me. If the work of the greatest of the Elizabethans was indeed indebted to the most eloquent and influential piece of literary criticism produced in its time, why has this fact, or even the possibility of this fact, virtually escaped notice for over 300 years? Alright, folks, I'm glad that Alwyn Thaler said that. Like, we can almost end the video here, honest to God, because this is something that's been driving me personally crazy. Like, I have angst about this, that there's not many people out there connecting Sidney to Shakespeare, regardless of authorship question or identity. There's just not many people connecting Sidney to Shakespeare, and it seems almost like the most obvious rote thing. Like, as I said in early episodes, that when I took undergraduate school and you learn Renaissance literature, there are 3 people that you have to read, and you read them in this order: Spenser, Sidney, Shakespeare. Okay, and like,
They don't go with Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare, because technically Spenser kind of outlives him and technically doesn't.
Spenser does outlive him, but all of his most
His
famous
work.
stuff is from the early 80s.
Oh, wow, really? Okay,
Whereas
okay.
we don't know
Interesting.
when to date Sidney.
Yeah.
And Sidney's stuff does technically come out in the early 90s.
In the 90s, right? Okay, fair. Yeah, I was just wondering if that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I remember I asked you.
And honestly, you do Sidney and Spenser kind of at the same time, and it's like, this is the pre-Shakespeare stuff.
Yeah.
And then, okay, now Shakespeare time.
And it's funny because we've already insinuated that, like, Spenser and kind of Sidney kind of have some, like, overlap.
Yeah,
and
crazy
every time we had talked about, every time we were reading some books over here, every time they happened to mention Spenser, all of a sudden, boom, Sidney's right there, or vice versa, right?
Right.
And so,
and that is something that also gives
just humorous. It's it's humorous on our end too.
It is humorous, but like the flip side is it totally gives me anxiety, because like I don't want to be one of these monopolizing monolithic guys that's like, if I'm saying Sidney is Shakespeare and Spenser, that means when you go to undergrad's class, you're only learning Sidney, and it's like, I don't want to say that. I personally don't want to believe that only one guy, like, shout out Bastian Conrad. I know you think Marlowe is doing that, but like, I don't want to say that. Even if that is the case, I really don't. So like, as much as we're pitching Sidney as Shakespeare today, I'm not pitching Sidney as the only person in Shakespeare. And that's evident in Love's Labour's Lost. That's evident in pretty much every play that we're going to bring up. There's at least one other person, if not more. I don't think that there is a pure Sidney play. Maybe Love's Labour's Lost is the closest thing to it, but I don't even think, like, I know for a fact this isn't. Like, this probably has the Thomas Nash Decker hand in it, and I don't think that's Sidney. I think that's a different hand. I think, my gut instinct's that's Francis Bacon. I don't know why Sidney would be writing with Francis Bacon. I know they're, attached to the same circles, and they're, socially, closely related in senses, but, like, I don't have the exact documents, like, Francis Bacon's hanging out with Sidney all the time. That said, I haven't done too much legwork to look into Francis Bacon other than reading Francis Bacon's essays, his poetry, that stuff, but I haven't looked at all the historical documents, all the political, governmental documents, all his letters.
I feel like Sidney's kind of off the scene before Bacon's into his full kind of position or whatever too. So yeah, it's kind of hard to maybe document some of that stuff or find that connections when we need to. But
and along those lines, I do think that Sidney. A lot of people have commented on our boards, like, Sidney's not a dramatist. Like, sure, he's a great poet. Sure, he's a great essay writer. Sure, he could probably write drama if he wanted to, but he didn't want to. That's maybe another thing that I want to sort of clear up here.
Another dispel, because we were trying to hit that on the defensive poetry series, and we were clearly saying, like, it's not that he's definitely not interested in it. If anything, he's clinically, like, figured it all out.
He's like obsessed with it. He's like, he's thought a lot about it.
Yeah. Got a lot of thoughts on it for sure, and just I don't know where that narrative came in about people sort of been like, no, that's not him doing that. Definitely not interested in. Oh, they use the same sort of argument about he only believed in that one style of Aristotelian style or whatever. Such they have that one quip that they'll always kind of refer to, and then they'll kind of leave it and
absolutely.
Or it's a sort of taking maybe his own words out of context, probably type situation.
Let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and turn into part 1. Okay, Okay, so here we got this opening quote. There are many mysteries contained in poetry, which of purpose were written darkly, lest by profane wits it should be abused. What a great quote. That's Shakespearean already. It's like through a glass darkly. It maybe is saying that, like, if you're not in the know, you're not going to understand this.
Yeah.
And it seems largely that all of humanity's not been in the know on this, and that's why we're all here, We
got our they live glasses on now.
Now that we have the Sidney lenses on, maybe, just maybe, we can start to make heads or tails of what is happening in Shakespeare. Because, not going to sit here and dispel everything that Baconians and Oxfordians have done, but you've had 100 years, folks. You've had 100 years. You didn't get it done. So we got a new century, new millennium. Sidney's here. Whys and wherefores. I'm going to skip down. Here it says, 50-odd years ago, Professor A.S. Cook prefaced his excellent edition of Sidney's Defense of Poetry, otherwise known as an apology for poetry, with the remark that, quote, what Sidney outlined, Spenser and Shakespeare executed, though not always in the precise forms which he himself would have approved. And then Thaler says, well, so far as I know, however, no one has yet attempted to join in one comprehensive study the precepts of the greatest of the Elizabethan critics with the examples of the mighty poet whose career began soon after Sidney's death in 1586. Even Thaler's like, it happens like right, Shakespeare kind of pops on the scene, conveniently right after Sidney dies. Maybe not right after. But he says, I make this attempt here, that no one seems to have made it hitherto as understandable in one sense. In Sidney's Arcadia and his Astrophil and Stella, students have long since found materials upon which Shakespeare drew in writing King Lear. Did you guys know that? Did you know that, you Oxfordians out there? That it's about the guy with the 3 daughters. That must be De Vere. Why is he pulling on 2 different Sidney texts? That's acknowledged. Why is he doing that? What's happening here? Okay. And not just King Lear, the sonnets, and perhaps some of his other plays. And we're going to show you it's not just these. But what stories or poetic themes could Shakespeare possibly have drawn from a mere critical tractate like the Defense of Poetry? And so, I want to dedicate this episode to anybody named Patrick. Whether it's Patrick Tilton, Patrick Sullivan, you Oxfordian Patricks out there that watch and comment on our videos, or Patrick Buckridge, who writes essays and is a Shakespeare scholar, or maybe even St. Patrick, the man who drove the snakes first out himself.
Who we actually showed in the last episode. Part of that folklore stuff is related to St. Patrick.
Well, and, the German word for snake is ver, Maybe we are St. Patrick. Maybe we are driving it out. Okay. That was on the cuff, guys. That was on the fly. I didn't even plan that. Okay. All right. Going down farther, he says, I suggest in reply that a reading of Sidney's eloquent essay could hardly have failed to delight or at least to challenge Shakespeare's own critical sense, whoever Shakespeare is. If so, however, why has not this answer occurred to others long before now? I venture two explanations. First, Shakespearean criticism has had many other questions to answer. Totally true. Go Google on JSTOR, which we got JSTOR open. Go Google, just search Shakespeare in JSTOR. You will get 10,000 essays about 10,000 different things. They're going to connect it to Freud, Jung, the weather, religion, politics, anything. You can tie anything to Shakespeare, and people do. And so Sidney's just one of those anythings, you know? Second, ever since Milton's time, so, you know, maybe 30 to 50 years after the folio is put out, and long after Carlyle's and Emerson's, so into the 1900s when he's starting to write, the majority of readers have accepted too readily the legendary half-truth that Shakespeare, Fancy's child, was the great exemplar of vitally spontaneous genius, unconscious of art, unconcerned with criticism. And so, what is he talking about there? I gotta unpack that for a second. There was a literal critical belief held not just among fans of Shakespeare, not just lay readers, but scholars as well. Throughout the 16 and 17 into the 1800s, there was a belief, and a taught belief, a held doctrine, that Shakespeare was so good at what he did because of what is called divine inspiration. And it's quite literally what it sounds like. The belief was that he had this unbelievable imagination because he was inspired by God, not unlike our Anglo-Saxon poets from like Dream of the Rood or Cadman's Hymn. You know, that they're just these guys and all of a sudden divine inspiration. And maybe time to shout out some of our commenters that, you know, have some wilder beliefs about Shakespeare, that maybe he's getting his ideas beamed to him through a microchip. You know, maybe it sounds crazy, and I don't know if I buy it, but it does line up with this whole idea of divine inspiration. Like, because at some point, how else does he get all this stuff? Where is all this coming from? But anybody that says divine inspiration has not done the decades and decades and decades and decades of legwork spotting the almost infinite amount of sources that Shakespeare is drawing from. And one of those sources, as Alwyn Thaler is pointing out here, seems to be the works of Sidney, and specifically in here, the Defense of Poetry. And so, yeah, divine inspiration, that was like literally a belief. And like, so that's why people have not had to have the argument about his education for so long. It's like, it doesn't matter. He was divinely inspired.
He's just spontaneously creating things, you know.
And since we've knocked that down, it was sort of an issue, and that's where a lot of Shakespeare authorship stuff was coming up in the early 1900s, was like, okay, this divine inspiration's garbage. Where is this coming from? And Stratfordians have since had to conjecture a lot of stuff, maybe make up a lot of stuff, and twist the narrative on a lot of stuff by saying, oh, everybody at that time was this learned. Everybody at this, okay, if everybody at this time is this learned, why don't we have a million Shakespeares? But ironically, maybe I'm arguing we do have more than one Shakespeare, but not today. Okay. For the moment, I suggest merely that the failure to put together Sidney's precepts and Shakespeare's practice has kept critics, commentators, and editors, Sidney's as well as Shakespeare's, from recognizing many significant points of contact between the two poets. At the very least, many useful illustrations of Elizabethan idiom in thought and word, and analyzing later the chief elements of Sidney's treatise, I shall cite chapter and verse systematically to substantiate the view that almost every major idea or principle in the defense can be illustrated in some measure by Shakespeare's practice.
Which is like literally verbatim what we do, what Chance and I have already said in those defensive posy videos. Like, Yeah, he's literally from down to how do we have these like cool little meme quips, for the whole country to sort of just know, or how can we, sort of create like a certain, sort of national identity with, with art and poetry as the vehicle to convey all this sort of stuff.
If I was going to write my first comedy, it would probably be about the, everyday human errors of life.
The everyday comedies or the everyday errors of life. Yeah, dude, that's nuts.
Like, okay, and what was Shakespeare's first comedy? Or first play, even? Is cited by, Shakespearean scholars? Comedy of Errors. Okay. So let's see. Skipping to the next page. He says, first, several of Sidney's editors have noted that one of his most eloquent passages won the immediate admiration of his contemporaries. So much so that Harrington, that's Sir John Harrington, who was a very well-liked poet and has been maybe confused with Shakespeare at some points. I forget, A Lover's Complaint. It's a poem from 1609, and people have said, oh, that's Shakespeare, and then, no, now we say, oh, it's Sir John Harrington. Alright, so much so that Sir John Harrington quoted in his brief apology in 1591, 4 years before Sidney's work was printed. So, even before it's printed, other people are quoting it. It is the passage in which Sidney holds that the poet's teaching excels the philosopher's because it substitutes for abstract particularities, words, and delightful proportion the well-enchanting skill of music. And a story, quote, with a tale, forsooth, he cometh unto you with a tale which holdeth children from play and old men from the chimney corner. Sidney's editors underscore Harrington's use of this passage, but hardly any editors, Sidney's or Shakespeare's, mention the strikingly similar passage in Love's Labour's Lost. Rosaline is the speaker and her subject is the mirthful Baroun. Sweet and voluble poetic discourse. His fair tongue utters such apt and gracious words that aged ears play truant at his tales and younger hearings are quite ravished. Once again, quoting or paraphrasing, with a tale, forsooth, he cometh unto you, with a tale which holdeth children from play and old men from a chimney corner, or aged ears play truant and younger hearings are quite ravished. It's the same idea. Okay, weird. But this is him just rattling out stuff off the cuff. This isn't even his, this is just his intro, right? So, another. For preliminary notice, also, I submit another instance, emphatically marked by both our poets, of their oft-repeated insistence upon the fact that one of the most important gifts of the true poet is the art of telling a good story. The austere admonitions of the philosopher, to quote Sidney again, are humanized by the delightful tales of the good fellow poet. Here's an instance. The one of Menenius Agrippa, so that's from Coriolanus, who, when the Roman plebs were rebellious, behaved himself like a homely and familiar poet. Let us set side by side Sidney's account of Menenius' behavior and Shakespeare's version as recorded in Coriolanus. So, this is him paraphrasing. According to Sir Philip, Menenius met the emergency with the quick instinct of a true poet. Quote, he telleth them a tale, one of these unforgettably, quote, pretty tales of the poets, as Sidney describes them a moment later. The tale of Menenius, in sum, comes to this, quote, there was a time when all the parts of the body made a mutinous conspiracy against the belly. And so we have Menenius saying, I shall tell you a pretty tale. There was a time when all the body's members rebelled against the belly, thus accused it.
Wow.
Okay. That's... okay, whatever. Coincidence. Coincidence. Mere coincidence. Mere coincidence. No. Oxford Shakespeare. Mere coincidence. Stratford Shakespeare. Not Philip Sidney. The man's dead. Okay. Let me go further. In discussing Shakespeare's sources and analogs for this ancient and widespread fable, Chambers and Furness do not mention Sidney's version at all. Sidney's editors do somewhat better, that is to say, several of them annotate the passage in defense with the suggestion, cf. Shakespeare Coriolanus. But none of them, to my knowledge, has observed that this is still another pretty tale told by a poet to keep children from play or mischief, and that Shakespeare's lines are, on the whole, closer to Sidney's than any one of the other sources hitherto suggested. So this isn't someone pulling it from a common source. This is him pulling it from Sidney. If Shakespeare is not Sidney, he's pulling it directly from Sidney. This is a direct connection. In the identical phrasing of the opening clause, there was a time when all the, and the twice repeated adjective mutinous. A third example, good phrases, says Shallow, are surely and ever were very commendable. Shallow is going to be from...
Merry Wives, right?
Yes, thank you.
Because it's from the Candle and the Quote we had here.
Yes, thank you. All good Elizabethans loved good phrases, Sidney and Shakespeare not least of all. Of course, Sir Philip protested that he was no pick-purse of another's wit, but a good phrase was another's matter. Witness Astrophil and Estella and the defense itself. As for Shakespeare, the way in which Shakespeare picked up phrases is as baffling and as clear and open as is the way of a maid with a man. So yeah, like, Thaler's like, I don't know how Shakespeare does it. He seems to pull from everyone, which that's partly why Brady and I are like, this can't be one person. As for Shakespeare, quote, the way in which Shakespeare picked up to illustrate, I submit another group of Shakespearean phrases which seem not far removed from Sidney's in his Defense of Poetry. Quoting the Defense of Poetry, the ancients never or very daintily match hornpipes in funerals. Comedy should be full of delight. Tragedy still maintained in a well-raised admiration. Quoting from Hamlet, the first act, with mirth in funeral and dirge in marriage, an equal scale weighing delight and dole. So it's not a perfect match of diction or phraseology, but it's the same idea, right? Okay. Continuing onwards. High and excellent tragedy openeth the greatest wounds and showeth forth the ulcers that are covered with tissue. Hamlet says, lay not that flattering unction to your soul, it will but skin and film the ulcerous place, while rank corruption mining all within infects unseen. So we have maybe not the same exact idea, but we have the same metaphor being used maybe for different purposes, but some ulcer being covered with skin. Which, by the way, Philip Sidney, according to Oxfordians themselves, had to deal with sores on his body and face, maybe from getting a bout of the pox that he maybe caught from his mom, who caught it from Queen Elizabeth. And so, yeah, maybe that would make sense why he's dealing with that. Biography, folks. Okay. I yield that poesy, or poetry, being abused by the reason of the sweet charming force, can do more hurt than any other army of words. Okay, quoting the Merchant of Venice. How every fool can play upon the word. The fool that hath planted in his memory an army of good words. Army of good words, like army of words. That's a weird metaphor to like repeat.
Also, it does remind me of that Apollo Cobain quote, though. You know, with the dialect. Yeah. The dialect is an army, or is
a nation is an
army with a dialect or something, right? Or was it? Or is it language is an army with a dialect or something like that?
Yeah.
One of those lines. Army and words. A might of power behind words that you can use.
Okay.
But as he says right after, but good phrases, however commendable, are not the whole story.
Yeah, you can keep going.
No, you can.
Okay. My fourth illustration will serve to test the hypothesis that Shakespeare may have remembered more than an occasional phrase of Sidney's. In an earlier study, I pointed out that Shakespeare, like Sidney, frequently emphasizes the importance of creative imagination. At that writing, however, I had not studied Sidney with close reference to Shakespeare, and it seems like nobody has, folks. Sorry. At any rate, I then missed, like everyone else, so far as I've been able to discover, what now seems to me a striking series of likenesses between two of the most familiar passages in Shakespeare. The lines on the poetic imagination in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Sidney's eloquent disquisition on the same general subject in The Defense. Within their limits, these passages, with others in kind, to be mentioned later, mark Sidney's and Shakespeare's claims for a place in the ranks of England's poet critics, as predecessors of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Matthew Arnold. Quote, whatsoever action, the historian recites that may the poet make his own, having all, from Dante his heaven to his hell under his pen. The lunatic lover and the poet are of imagination all compact. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and imagination bodies forth. So we have this idea that that's what the poet does. Dante is the stand-in for the ultimate poet, glances between heaven and hell, or in this case, earth and heaven. But it's the above and below sort of hermetic idea that's bringing forth this, you're merging the two. You're literally like
alchemizing.
Yeah, alchemizing or
combining, right?
Fertilizing. This is like the birth is happening. Let's see. Philosophical definitions lie dark before the imaginative and judging power if they be not figured forth by the speaking picture of poetry. The forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns to them that gives to them shapes. Oh, sorry, I gotta read one more. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth make forms such as never were in nature. The forms of things unknown to the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives them airy nothing, a local habitation and a name. Such tricks hath strong imagination. And so, these are all the same ideas. And there's a lot between Defensive Poetry and Midsummer Night's Dream. The poets give names to make their picture the more lively. The poet never maketh any circles about your imagination to conjure you to believe for true what he writes. The poet's persons and doings are but pictures, allegorically and figuratively written. Quote from Midsummer Night's Dream. The best in this kind are but shadows, and the worst are no worse, if imagination amend them. Quote from Macbeth. The sleeping and the dead are but as pictures. And so, some of these may just be commonplace, as pictures, but pictures. But some of these, it's like the same exact philosophical ideas with some of the same literal phrases. Let me turn a little farther. Let's go to page 10. Okay, yeah, we're there. If Shakespeare had written a systematic treatise, and I'm skipping down the middle here, on poetics, he could not possibly have escaped the influence of the defense. Each critic, like each poet, says Gregory Smith, might well suspect his neighbor, and he proves that Sidney's work was known to everybody and cited by nearly all the Elizabethan critics. Though Shakespeare certainly did not write a systematic critique of poetry, it would have been almost impossible for him to be ignorant of the defense, if only because he was a player, a poet, and a playwright. As already indicated, he certainly knew the Arcadia and Astrophil and Estella. Knowing these works, how could the young poet-dramatist, who apparently read everything in sight, have failed to read the most trenchant and universally quoted dramatic criticism written in his time, that of the defense? Particularly so in view of the fact that Sidney was well known to the players, specifically to Leicester's men, with whom Shakespeare might have begun his career. And even if Shakespeare didn't begin his career with Leicester's men, there's plenty of dudes in Leicester's men that carry over into the Henslow group and then later into the Lord Chamberlain's men and King's men. Such a one maybe is Will Kemp. Will Kemp is maybe the third most famous actor of the time behind Edward Allen and Richard Burbage. Will Kemp is hugely famous. I mean, yes, Shakespeare and Johnson are more famous now, but for being an actor, Will Kemp was famous of his time. Will Kemp was has been documented to have been a messenger boy for Sidney. Sidney wrote some letters to Walsingham a few months before he died, and he was like, hey, I'm sending this letter with Will Kemp, he's going to get it to you. He didn't say Will Kemp, he said the jester of Leicester's men, which would have been Will Kemp. So, just throwing that out there. Oh, okay. Well, I skipped ahead. Sorry. Witness Sidney's letter to Walsingham, written on March 24th, 1586, not long before his death, which has been thought to allude to Shakespeare's fellow Will Kemp. I wrote to you a letter by Will, my lord of Leicester's jesting player. Nor are Shakespeare's contacts with the defense limited to these general probabilities. Not only the critics knew it, but also the poets. Among the former, Puttenham and Florio, like Harrington, alluded to it even before, and Francis Mears soon after its publication. As for the poets, men of such varied caliber as Thomas Churchyard, Michael Drayton, Spencer, Vaughan, and Wither, Thomas Nash, Ben Jonson praised or imitated Sidney's essay. For our purposes, Ben Jonson's repeated and unequivocal allusions to the defense of poetry deserve special notice. And I'll skip ahead. As regards Jonson and the defense, scholars have indicated at least 4 sets of contexts. Spinyard, for example, asserts that Jonson's definition of poetry and timber is substantially in keeping with Sidney's, and another investigator suggested that Jonson's attack upon poet apes in the Poetaster repeats Sidney's. The cause of why poetry is not esteemed in England is the faults of poet apes, not poets. More definitely conclusive are Jonson's allusions to Sidney's treatise and the poetry to every man is humor in the second act of The Silent Woman. The prologue unmistakably harks back to Sidney's attack upon the early dramatists' faulty disregard of the unities of place and time, their stage children, whose children and grandchildren are begotten in 2 hours of space, their hideous monster, and their cruel stage armies represented with 4 swords and bucklers. These gross absurdities of Sidney's stage, Jonson matches in his excoriation of the ill customs of his age. To make a child now swaddled to shoot up past 60 years, or with 3 rusty swords fight over York and Lancaster's long jars. So it's not just Shakespeare. Jonson seems to be directly quoting from Sidney. And then one more little note. The exchange of views in The Silent Woman concludes as follows. A knight lives by his verses. The noble Sidney lives by his. So, Ben Jonson's definitely a fan of Philip Sidney. We can go farther in this, guys, but let me see. I'm going to skip ahead to... I'm going to skip ahead to the bottom of page 23. On the other hand, I have already indicated that Shakespeare, no less than Sidney, flinched at the crude mingling of mirth and tragedy in the popular medleys such as that in the lamentable tragedy, mixed full of pleasant mirth, entitled King Cambyses, which Falstaff laughed out of the court. The first inclination of Duke Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream was to do just that with the most lamentable comedy and most cruel death of Pyramus and Thisbe. A tedious brief scene of young Pyramus and his love Thisbe, very tragical mirth. Merry and tragical, tedious and brief, that is hot ice and wondrous strange snow. How shall we find the concord of this discord? Of comedy, definition and function, abuse, right use and defended, proper subjects and characters, comic laughter. As intimated above, Sidney grants freely that our tragedies and comedies are not without cause cried out against, observing rules neither of honest civility nor of skillful poetry. Abuse of the comic by naughty playmakers and stage keepers has justly made it odious. But the right use of comedy has high values. And so, I've seen Oxfordians say, Sidney hated tragic comedies because he's making fun of famous victories of Henry V, and that's why he couldn't be Shakespeare. Except Shakespeare himself is making fun of that exact same stuff in Midsummer Night's Dream, which I said in a previous video that Sidney has totally unlocked that play for me. I don't see how, if you're reading that from any other lens, how you can unlock that play. Oberon is just some weird fairy king character, but if you're looking at through a Sidney lens or a Dyer lens, Oberon is totally a stand-in for Robert Lester. And Oberon is itself a near anagram for Robert. So maybe there's something there to it. And Oberon is sitting there puppeteering everybody through the play, through his minions, and that's exactly what Lester did through Dyer, through Hatton, through Sidney, through a bunch of people. So it's why hasn't that connection been made? But why would the Stratford man be making an allegory on Robert Lester, who was dead by 1588? Well, maybe Midsummer Night's Dream is written a little earlier, and I've seen several things that show a lot of the sources for Midsummer Night's Dream are coming from the mid-80s. So, there's that. That said, I think we'll call it... here, I want to do one more from here, but then we'll call it here. Go to page 27. And so we're starting towards the top in the middle of the paragraph. It says, "Yet this very Jacques, who is one of the characters in As You Like It, the sundry contemplation of whose travels had wrapped him in a most humorous sadness, was, according to Sidney's own pronouncement, a proper character for comedy. Quote, a busy loving courtier, a heartless threatening Thrasso, a self-wise seeming schoolmaster, and a wry transformed traveler. These, Sidney writes, if we saw walk in stage names, therein we delightful laughter. By the same token, it follows that Sidney would have admitted as proper subjects for comic laughter such characters or personages as King Ferdinand and his loving lords in Love Labour's Lost. And they're not too wise-seeming schoolmaster Holofernes, which, by the way, folks, it's acknowledged in, Oxford collection of Sidney's works that Holofernes from Love Labour's Lost is based on a character from a masque that Sidney wrote in the late 70s called The Lady of May. There's a character in it named Rhombus, and Rhombus says things like, now thunder-thumping Jove transfund his dotes into your excellent formosity, which have with the resplendent beams thus segregated the enmity of these rural animals. I am potentissima domina, a schoolmaster, that is to say, a pedagogue. Okay, let's see what Holofernes sounds like. The deer was, as you know, sanguis, in blood, ripe as palm water, who now hangeth like a jewel in the ear of Collio, the sky, the welkin, the heaven, and anon falleth like a crab on the face of Terra, the soil, the land, the earth. Most barbarous intimation, yet a kind of insinuation, as it were, in via, in way of explication, facere, as it were, replication. It's the same exact shtick, right? So even if it's not Sidney, it's so directly influenced from Sidney's character, where you have this schoolmaster that is making up Latinate words into English, but also dropping Latin, like clearly in clunky, silly ways, and it's just for that character to flex his own Latin abilities. Okay. And they're not too wise-seeming schoolmaster Holofernes, together with the loudmouth pistol and their empty threatening Parolles. Who can doubt, moreover, that Sidney, if he had lived to see them, would have welcomed the delightful laughter such personages as Mercutio and Dogberry, Benedict, Beatrice, Autolycus, and Juliet's nurse. To conclude this section, it would be worth our while to glance at Sidney's challenging discussion of comic laughter and Shakespeare's responsive practice. I'm going to end that on that. I'll let you guys go check this out on archive.com or go pick up a copy yourself. But I would like to quickly glance at these essays and then call it a day. Alright, so this is Shakespeare, Sidney, and Marlowe, The Metamorphoses of Love. I just have a few quotes that I want to pick out from this. Let's see. Cyrus Hoy, who's a big shot scholar on page 451, second paragraph here. Whatever the difference in poetic technique or psychological coherence of the world of the Arcadia, is not essentially different from the world of Shakespearean comedy. Quote, the two princes of the Arcadia are near kin to Brown and his fellow academics in Love Labour's Lost, or Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing. The confusions to which lovers are prone under cover of darkness are familiar from A Midsummer Night's Dream, but even closer in tone to the erotic ambiguities of the climax of the Arcadia are those equivocal occasions in All's Well That Ends Well and Measure for Measure when Bertram and Angelo, like Sidney's basilisk, eagerly present themselves to the bed of a desired mistress only to embrace unwittingly a scorned wife. And he continues on talking more about similarities, but I'll skip ahead 2 more pages. Since the Arcadia is usually, in its original version at least, termed a tragicomedy, the destructive power of love is never fully explored, but it is hinted at. It remains for Shakespeare, whose comic world inherits so much from Sidney, to examine fully the potential for tragedy that has been present all along in the force of passion. Okay, so once again, Shakespeare's kind of the inheritor of Sidney. Going further, 2 more pages. Accessibility to life carries risks. It means that one is vulnerable to unpleasant as well as pleasant emotions, and the transformations affected by emotion may either elevate or degrade, as Sidney's Arcadia and Shakespeare's plays make clear. It is to prefer the static fixity of one's unchanging personality to the transforming, recreative life of shared experience, To be accessible to life is to be liable to risks, and they are not inconsiderable as the sufferings of Romeo and Juliet or Troilus or Othello prove. But to be inaccessible to life is also to be liable to risks, and while these will not necessarily be more devastating than the former kind, they tend to be more desolating. Marlowe's plays provide a harrowing glimpse of them. So he's going to go on and compare Sidney and Shakespeare to Marlowe and show that Marlowe's almost the inversion of this stuff. And then he says a few pages later, on 456, Marlowe's protagonists are furiously engaged in the work of making themselves inaccessible to life. In all of them, there is the tendency to hold themselves proudly aloof from society as a whole, of which they have nothing but contempt. I'll say that that's exactly a perfect description of what people said about Philip Sidney. And if he is faking his death to get away from society, that fits in perfectly a line. Okay, and then his closing lines. Occasionally, like a wistful memory from a Sidneyan or Shakespearean golden world, there appears the wan hope that someone might come live with him and be his love, but there is nothing in Marlowe's frozen world to sustain love, so that it is a potential power of metamorphosis goes unrealized, and the spaces of the plays echo with a peculiar emptiness. And that's not to denigrate Marlowe, that's to say that he's doing the inversion, whoever's writing Marlowe, he's doing the inversion of the Shakespearean and Sidneyan ideal of metamorphosis. And then, last but not least, let's see if I quote a few of these. Okay, there's one quote in this other essay. This other essay is going over and over about love's labor's lost, and the idea of Renaissance love, and it's connecting a lot to Sidney's Astrophil and Estella. And he says on page 339, that's going to be page 6, the same kind of questioning of spirituality and love, and the same kind of tongue-in-cheek treatment of Petrarchan commonplaces are to be found in Sidney's Astrophil Estella. The renunciation of artifice, which one critic writes is shared by Sidney and Brown, one of the main characters of Love Labor's Lost, tells just part of the story. Brown is a vehicle for doubt and cynicism, but he does not stand alone. Like Astrophil and Stella, Shakespeare's plays seem in its entirety a vehicle for the discarding of higher ideals of another age. And Love's Labor's Lost, if it does anything at all, goes about its iconoclastic business with a good deal more fervor than Sidney's vacillating Astrophil. So, once again, we get this idea that Love's Labor's Lost, Brown specifically, is a development of the Sidneyan character type. And we can probably call it here, folks. We could go on this for hours and hours and hours, but I hope I have at least opened up the door for people being open to the idea that there's a lot of Sidney and Shakespeare. Go look for yourself. Go start reading some of these comedies. Go read the Arcadias. Start looking for yourself. Start looking at some of these essays, because we need to start figuring out why there's Sidney and Shakespeare. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Sidney's not alive. But why is there so much Sidney and Shakespeare? But yeah, on that note, dude, you want to close it out here?
Yeah, and go back and check out some of our other Sidney videos as well. The defensive posy sort of breakdown analysis that we did, and yeah, check our sources. See if you're seeing what we're seeing, because yeah, we just read through just that source, and you kind of saw them kind of literally paired up, and we were just kind of spitballing, being like, hey, that kind of sounds like this, and well, dude, he's doing some actual, real close textual comparisons, like,
Absolutely.
So yeah, go back and check out some of our catalogs, see if it strikes your fancy. But otherwise, yeah, go read for yourself, as we always say around here. Nullius in verba, and to all a good night.